January 17, 1991. Fireworks exploded over Baghdad, Iraq. The United States and coalition forces were officially at war. Specialist Douglas George Jewell, age 18, waited at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, for his orders. A proud young man, immediately upon graduating from Penfield High School and hailing from East Rochester, New York, he volunteered to serve. This assignment with the 9003rd would result in Doug's exposure to a variety of toxins, which included but were not limited to depleted uranium, a nuclear weapon, anthrax, botulism, both suspended in squalene vaccines, sarin and cyclosarin gas, DEET and other pesticides, and a variety of other unknown toxins from the burning oil fields. 200 oil fields were set ablaze by Saddam Hussein during this war. Back in East Rochester, New York, Doug's family waited, and I, his high school girlfriend, prayed that he would return and that the Persian Gulf War would not be as Vietnam. This time, the United States would need to color inside the lines, rewrite the script from Vietnam, not spend years and years sending soldiers over to die. There should be no Agent Orange airbrushed over the war front. There should be no charcoal black Hiroshima, no ochre red nuclear warfare, like in the Cold War as we feared. This war would be different this time, I believed. General Schwarzkopf and Secretary Powell promised a clear, quick, swift victory with few casualties as possible. And yet, the U.S. left a massive ink blot on the Middle East through the environmental disaster that occurred, through the toxins that were spilled into the Gulf and that were absorbed into the bodies of innocent children and civilians and soldiers who were misinformed as to what they had been exposed to. This project is the Gulf War Oral History Project, a project that I have been working on and interviewing veterans from all branches of service throughout all theaters, all areas of the war, and these are their stories. Conditions on the war front were horrific. This is Lance Corporal Darlow of Lockport, New York, who served with the 10th Marine Division, 2nd Marines. He stood in a foxhole as oil rained down upon him. He breathed in the toxic fumes, and he stood on the front lines on a sand berm, just looking the enemy in the eye on the border of northern Saudi Arabia facing Iraq. The sky was black as night for days because the sky was covered with clouds due to the oil fires. And yet, as promised, David did return home alive, as did most of our soldiers and troops. And yet, in the days upon returning home, he broke out in a blistery rash. He suffered psoriasis for years, stomach cramps, debilitating muscle pain. Finally, in 2010, almost 20 years later, he was diagnosed officially with Gulf War illness. His symptoms, a combination of PTSD, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, and sleep apnea. And every day, David wakes up with debilitating muscle pains, and oftentimes returns to bed after being awake for several hours. What could have caused this? With so many toxins, it's very difficult for us to tease out. Was it uranium? Was it the vaccines? What could have caused Gulf War illness? Like David, Doug returned home alive to his grateful family. His mother, Sharon, welcomed him home with a celebration. Everyone was thrilled. But in the months and years that followed, Doug suffered tremendous amounts of critical illness that prevented him from fulfilling his life's dreams. Some of his symptoms also included stomach cramps, inability to leave the house many times, PTSD, depression, Crohn's disease. He underwent multiple surgeries at the VA hospital in Buffalo, New York. How could this be that we could have such a swift victory with so few casualties, and yet so few people know that Doug and David are not alone? Doug's greatest pride was that he drove water in the theater. He provided water to refugees who were seeking asylum, fleeing northern Iraq into Turkey. How could he be made and left to wonder what was going on with his body? How could he be ignored? Other veterans wondered the same thing. On November 3rd, 2017, in Tampa, Florida, hundreds of veterans gathered because they are angry that to this day, doctors at VA hospitals still don't know how to properly diagnose Gulf War illness. They don't tie the symptoms together. They don't put it together. And so they gathered on their own accord to educate doctors, inviting in care providers, and taping the symposium so that they could educate other VA providers throughout the country. Just how many veterans are sick? 250,000 of the 700,000 veterans who served in the Persian Gulf War are sick, chronically ill, with symptoms of Gulf War illness. That's a rate of 1 in 3. The vaccine botulism and anthrax were suspended in a substance called squalene. We now know that squalene has a high neurotoxicity, resulting in none other than stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting, muscle pain, neurological toxicity, tremors. We find squalene in many different types of vaccines. It's also curious that both deployed and non-deployed veterans who received these vaccines also have the same neurological symptoms. The pills you see here are called, in the field, PB pills, or pyrostigmide bromide. These pills were supposed to be an antidote to the sarin or cyclosarin gas that could be unleashed by Saddam Hussein onto our troops. Veterans had the fear put in them that if they didn't take the PB pill, they could suffocate, that they could bleed out, that they could just die right there in the field. And yet, there's a fine print warning that these have not been FDA approved, nor had they been field tested. So essentially, troops were ordered to take these pills that had not been FDA approved, as the Pentagon had sought a waiver in the name of national defense to administer these vaccines and pills to our troops. This is a direct violation of the Nuremberg Code, which states that you cannot experiment upon a vulnerable population who has no right to informed consent in that moment as they are in the theater of war. And yet this happened. The burning oil fires, the DEET that sprayed their encampments, the pesticides, which one of those possible causes could it be? In Baghdad Express, author Joel Turnipseed, who served with the 6th Marine Division transport, recalled that his superior officers threatened them that if they didn't take the pills, they'd lose their insurance. They'd be put on latrine duties. So they'd better take the things they were being ordered. Navy Corpsman Krista Grenier testified that while giving the pills in the field, per her orders, she was simultaneously ordered to destroy the record to whom she had given those pills. And she testified that to this very day, she still doesn't know why she needed to destroy the medical records of those who received these pills. And she is not the only Navy corpsman who has testified to this effect. How real was this threat of biological weapons? We certainly heard about it. We certainly worried about it. Well, Senator Regal wanted to know, as he was chair of the House Urban Committee, Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And the Regal report has become a very famous report that in 1994 did find that the United States had indeed sold these formulas for these very biological weapons to none other than Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War when Iraq was our ally. That's how we knew what could possibly be utilized against our troops, that's how we began to formulate vaccinations. In March of 1991, we bombed a biological weapons storage facility at Camisaya, and a toxic plume, which is described now by veterans as the plume, came across large portions of the theater. And for years, the government's take on this was that it was isolated, that it only, was in a certain area and only certain units were exposed. But we now know that that was not true, that this toxicity, because of the wind and because of the environmental factors, went all over the theater. And in fact, we have Linda Eberhardt, who was on a ship, the hospital ship Comfort, in the middle of the Gulf, who recalls walking outside and smelling toxicity in the air and knowing that there was a chemical attack. Although alarms would sound in the field and troops would be warned to don their mission-oriented protective posture, or MOP4 gear, which involves a charcoal suit and a gas mask, many times they were then ordered, oh, that was a false alarm. Now troops are wondering how many of those alarms were real, and how many times were they indeed exposed to chemicals. What's worse is that we waged a nuclear war. The Persian Gulf War was a nuclear war. The United States continues to coat its weapons that we shoot from airplanes and tanks with depleted uranium. What is depleted uranium anyway? Well, you can see behind me, these are nuclear plumes. Uranium is a heavy, toxic metal. It has a 400,000-year half-life. It causes genetic birth defects and alterations, elevations and alterations in hormonal balance. It's a nuclear weapon. And it was utilized and prolifically without warning. And the Pentagon admits that they have used it in both Iraq wars and estimated that 320 metric tons have been left in the environment surrounding Iraq. But the International Order of Physicians Against the Proliferation of Nuclear War estimates it's more like 1,000 metric tons. At the Basra Hospital, which is very close to the famous Highway of Death, which is where the United States and coalition forces had bombed the retreating Iraqi civilians and army, there are high concentrations of uranium. Doctors report that at least twice a month, a baby is born in Basra with severe birth defects. Some of the common defects that are seen are a syndrome known as Guillain-Barré syndrome. This syndrome results in microcephaly, missing limbs, misplaced, displaced, or missing organs, and club feet in the babies who are born with this disorder. Babies born of troops returning from Iraq also have this disorder. In April of 2008, Douglas Jewell lost his battle with Gulf War illness. It wasn't until 2007 that the United States began to order more in-depth research, more studies to be done to find out what could have possibly caused all of these illnesses that are constantly being diagnosed in our troops. This must be a lesson that these lies and perpetuation of falsehood, that this was a war with few casualties, must stop. The government must take responsibility for the atrocities that it's committing and count every one of these casualties as additional casualties of the Persian Gulf War. Far too many veterans like Doug cannot tell their story, so I choose to tell this story. I choose to be the voice to interview veterans and to get this word out of what happened in this war. I also urge you to insist that the Veterans Administration properly care for the veteran, his widow, and his child. It took 25 years for the VA to issue a report on the health of Gulf War veterans' children. Many spouses are also ill with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. These are civilians who had no contact other than contact with soldiers who served in this war. And finally, I urge each and every one of you to speak out and let your congresspeople know that we do not want to use depleted uranium as a weapon of war. This is in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. It causes human rights violations, and its effects are absolutely disastrous. So please join me in speaking out about these vital issues, and I thank you.